All right, buckle up, everybody. We're diving into the life of Mahatma Gandhi today.
A deep dive indeed.
You sent us excerpts from his Wikipedia page. Talk about a rabbit hole, right?
Definitely a lot to unpack, but that's why I'm here.
I'm ready to have my assumptions challenged.
I think you'll be surprised by what we unearth. Even with someone as famous as Gandhi, there's always more to discover.
Let's get to it then. Gandhi was born in 1869 in Gujarat, India, right? What was his family like?
Well, it was actually pretty complex, which I think is interesting for someone who's often seen as this sort of singular figure.
Okay, so tell me more. What made his family life stand out?
His father, for one, was chief minister of Porbandar state, a position of real authority.
Wow, so Gandhi came from a powerful family.
You might think so, but there's a twist. His father was actually a man of very limited education.
Oh, that is surprising. I would have assumed someone in his position would have, well, some schooling.
It wasn't uncommon back then, actually, but it created an interesting dynamic in the family, especially contrasted with Gandhi's mother. She was a deeply religious woman, a Pranami Vaishnava.
Pranami Vaishnava? That doesn't ring any bells.
It's a fascinating branch of Hinduism. They actually incorporate the Gita, Quran, and Bible into their core texts.
Whoa, talk about a blend of influences.
Exactly. Growing up with that kind of philosophical mix undoubtedly shaped his worldview, even from that young age.
Makes you wonder how much of that early exposure to diverse beliefs played into his later philosophies, right?
Absolutely. But that's not all. He was also married incredibly young, like shockingly young by today's standards.
Okay, how young are we talking here?
13.
13. You're kidding.
Nope. And to make things even more tragic, he lost both his father and his first child while he was still a teenager himself.
Oh, wow. That's a lot of loss at such a young age. It's hard to fathom. Did he ever talk about how those experiences affected him?
He did. He actually reflected on them quite a bit in his writing. He wrestles with regret over not being more present for his father, feeling like he was too caught up in what he calls his own animalistic passions at the time.
It's heartbreaking, but it also makes you think about how those early trials might have shaped his later views on life, death, and everything in between.
You're definitely on the right track. But let's not forget, he heads off to London for law school after all this.
Talk about a culture shock from that family life to Victorian England.
A huge one. And it's in London that we see two major influences emerge: vegetarianism and theosophy.
Okay, vegetarianism I get, but theosophy, you're going to have to break that one down for me.
Think of it as this kind of mystical movement, blending Eastern religions and philosophies, which, if you remember his upbringing, makes a lot of sense.
Ah, right, with his mother's religious background, it's like it all connects back.
Precisely. Now picture this: young Gandhi, super involved in the London Vegetarian Society.
Which tracks with vegetarianism being such a core principle for him later on.
Exactly. So there's this big debate happening in society about birth control, something he was morally opposed to.
So he's already this serious, principled young man.
Oh, absolutely. But here's the surprising part. Even though he felt strongly about it, he passionately defended other people's right to disagree with him. He argued for individual freedom and respecting different opinions, even back then.
Wow. That's pretty forward thinking, especially for that time period. It really speaks to his ability to engage in these tough conversations while staying true to his own moral compass.
Exactly. But this is still very early in his journey. He eventually ends up in South Africa, which in many ways becomes the real turning point for him.
In 1893, right. I feel like that move to South Africa is where his activism really takes root.
It's a pivotal period for him, for sure. He goes there to work as a lawyer, and over the next 21 years, his experiences there completely transform him.
And I'm guessing it wasn't all sunshine and roses.
Not even close. We're talking about being thrown off a train for having the audacity to sit with European passengers, being told to remove his turban in court. This was the reality of being Gandhi in South Africa.
It's difficult to even imagine encountering that kind of blatant racism day after day. How did he even cope with that kind of constant assault on his dignity?
Well, initially, he still clung to the idea of being a Briton. He still believed in the system, despite all the evidence to the contrary.
It's easy to judge that now, but I guess it's a testament to how deeply ingrained those colonial ideas were at the time.
Absolutely. But those experiences, those attacks on his very being, they chipped away at those beliefs. They forced him to confront the ugly reality of the empire he'd once believed in.
And that's the thing about injustice, right? It has this way of revealing the cracks in even the most deeply held beliefs.
Precisely. And for Gandhi, it was a turning point. He could have easily given up, returned to India defeated, but instead,
Instead, he chooses to fight back. He chooses to fight back, but not with violence, right? This is where his philosophy of nonviolent resistance really starts to solidify.
it does. And it's fascinating to see how it evolves. Like, he doesn't just immediately jump into this fully formed philosophy. It's a process, a journey.
So where do we see those early glimpses of satyagraha in action?
Well, instead of mirroring the hatred, he forms the Natal Indian Congress in 1894. This is huge.
It's such a strategic move. He's recognizing the power of collective action, of organizing and mobilizing a community that's been marginalized.
Absolutely. He's creating a power base, a platform to challenge the status quo. But it's not just about politics and protests.
There's more.
Oh, yeah. This is also when he founds Tolstoy Farm near Johannesburg.
Oh, well, okay, Tolstoy Farm. That name alone tells me we need to unpack this. What was it all about?
So it's this kind of experimental community he set up with his friend, Herman Kallenbach. Simple living, shared labor, self-sufficiency, all based on the principles of satyagraha.
Like a little utopia in the making.
In a way, yeah. It was a way for him to live out his ideals, to experiment with different models of community and resistance.
Were there any aspects of the farm that might surprise people today, knowing what we know now about, well, some of his views?
Yeah, that's a great point. Like his views on women's roles, for example. He definitely believed in the strength and contribution of women to the movement. But
he also had those more traditional ideas about their primary sphere being the home.
right. And it's something that continues to spark debate even today.
It's a reminder that these historical figures, even the ones we revere, they were products of their time, with all the complexities that come with that.
Absolutely. But there's no denying the impact of this period on Gandhi. By 1915, when he returns to India, he's not just a lawyer anymore. He's a seasoned activist.
Transformed by his experiences in South Africa.
Absolutely. He's seen firsthand the brutality of colonialism and the power of organized resistance.
And he returns to an India that's also changing rapidly. I mean, nationalism is on the rise. People are looking for leaders, for direction.
Right. It's a pivotal moment for India. But it's worth noting that Gandhi isn't exactly stepping into a vacuum. He had a mentor during this time.
Gopal Krishna Gokhale, right. You mentioned him earlier. How did their approaches to activism differ?
It's a fascinating contrast. Gokhale believed in working within the system, appealing to British reason and fairness. He was a big figure in the Indian National Congress, favored a more moderate path.
Which makes sense given his background. But Gandhi, after his experiences in South Africa, he saw things differently.
He'd come to believe that the system itself was the problem, that true freedom couldn't be achieved by asking politely.
It required something more, something bolder.
Direct action, harnessing the collective power of the people. This is where satyagraha, his philosophy of nonviolent resistance, really takes center stage.
And his early campaigns in India are like a masterclass in putting satyagraha into action.
Oh, absolutely. Like with the Champion agitation in 1917.
Where he fought for the rights of indigo farmers who were being exploited by British plantation owners.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then in 1918, there are the Quetta agitations.
Where he demanded tax relief for peasants who were hit hard by floods and famine.
Right. And it's in Quetta where we see his strategic brilliance really shining through.
How so?
He organizes this massive signature campaign where peasants pledge to refuse paying taxes, even if it means losing their land.
Wow. It's incredible the courage that must have taken, but it's also brilliant, right? He's basically calling the British government's bluff.
Exactly. It's nonviolent resistance at its finest, and it captures global attention.
Gandhi's becoming this international symbol of resistance against colonialism. So he's got momentum, he's racking up these early victories, and then things get complicated, right? With the Caliphate movement.
Right. World War I has just ended. The Ottoman Empire, which holds the Islamic Caliphate, is on the verge of collapse.
And Gandhi sees an opportunity here.
He does. He sees a chance to unite Hindus and Muslims in India against British support for dismantling the Caliphate.
It's a bold move. Trying to bridge that religious divide to create a united front against British rule.
And initially, it works. The Caliphate movement gains a lot of traction. It leads to a surge in Muslim support for Gandhi.
But it also brings its share of challenges and criticisms.
Definitely. He faces pushback from some Hindu leaders who feel like he's prioritizing Muslim concerns over their own.
And then there's Muhammad Ali Jinnah,
who will go on to lead the Muslim League and the creation of Pakistan. Yeah.
Talk about a foreshadowing of the conflicts to come.
Right. Jinnah was vehemently opposed to Gandhi's nonviolent approach. He favored a more constitutional path to independence, and these fundamental differences would have huge consequences down the road.
It really highlights the complexities of this period and the challenges of uniting such a diverse nation, even under a common goal.
Absolutely.
But amidst all of this, Gandhi continues to build his movement. And this is when those iconic images start to emerge. Gandhi spinning his own cloth, leading the Salt March to Dandi.
Images that would come to define his legacy for sure.
And those images are a direct result of his actions. Let's talk about the non-cooperation movement in 1920. I mean, that was huge.
It was massive, a nationwide movement. Gandhi calls for a complete boycott of British institutions and goods.
People embracing homespun cloth,
Mm-hmm.
khadi, renouncing British titles, even pulling their kids from British schools. It was a complete societal shift. It's like he tapped into this deep well of cultural pride. It became about reclaiming their own identity, not just rejecting British rule.
Absolutely. And it really exposed the fragility of British control. They relied on Indian cooperation, which was quickly evaporating.
And of course, they didn't just sit back and watch it happen.
Not at all. Gandhi's arrested for sedition and imprisoned for 2 years. But even behind bars, his influence couldn't be contained.
Which brings us to one of the most iconic moments in his story, the Salt March in 1930. I mean, come on, the imagery alone. Gandhi, at 61 years old, marching to the sea to make salt.
It's such a powerful act of defiance, and so strategic, too.
So, it seems so simple, salt.
Exactly. It was this basic necessity, completely controlled by the British salt tax. By making salt himself, Gandhi exposed the absurdity of it all.
He was showing the world that this oppressive system rested on controlling the most basic things in people's lives.
Exactly. It was a simple act with profound implications, and it resonated far beyond India. People around the world were inspired by the Salt Satyagraha.
But it wasn't without risk. I mean, even nonviolent resistance can provoke a violent response.
Sadly, that's true. The British response to the Salt Satyagraha was brutal. Mass arrests, beatings of peaceful protesters. It was a dark chapter, for sure.
It must have been incredibly difficult to stay committed to nonviolence in the face of that.
Absolutely. And it's important to note that women played a crucial role throughout these movements, especially the Salt Satyagraha.
They marched, they picketed, they faced down the same brutality.
Even with some of Gandhi's more traditional views on women's roles, there's no denying their importance in the fight for independence.
So we've got Gandhi leading these huge acts of civil disobedience. The world's watching. What's the reaction from the British government at this point? Are they starting to realize the jig is up?
There were definitely cracks starting to show. Some British leaders were acknowledging the need for change, for negotiation, but then you had figures like Winston Churchill, who saw Gandhi as this dangerous threat.
Oh, absolutely. Churchill was vehemently opposed to Indian independence. He saw it as the dismantling of the British Empire.
Exactly. So you have this clash of ideologies, those in power clinging to the old ways, while Gandhi and the Indian people are demanding a new future.
And it's in this context that Gandhi participates in the Roundtable conferences in London.
Right, 1931. It's his only trip outside India during this whole period, and he goes as the sole representative of the Indian National Congress. Imagine the pressure.
Sitting across from those who held the power he was challenging, what was the outcome of those talks?
Well, on one hand, they were a testament to Gandhi's commitment to his principles.
That's-
He refused any lavish accommodations, choosing to stay in a working-class neighborhood in London's East End.
Wow. He could have demanded the best, but instead he chose to connect with everyday people to understand their struggles.
It was a powerful statement about his values. But ultimately, the conferences failed to achieve their goal.
Which was full independence for India.
Right. The British weren't willing to go that far. And one of the big sticking points was this idea of separate electorates.
What were those? I'm not familiar with that.
Essentially, it was a proposal to create separate voting systems for Hindus and Muslims. The British argued that it was about protecting minority rights.
But Gandhi saw right through it.
He did. He saw it as a divide and conquer tactic that would fracture Indian society. And sadly, history would prove him right.
That disagreement over separate electorates fed into the tensions that eventually led to the partition of India and Pakistan.
Exactly. This is a tragic example of how even the best intentions can have unintended consequences. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're on the verge of World War II now. How does Gandhi respond to this global conflict?
Right, because he was always opposed to violence, even in self-defense.
Yes, he saw it as hypocritical to fight for freedom abroad while India was still under British rule. So in 1942, He launches the Quit India movement.
Which, even with Gandhi imprisoned once again, ultimately sets the stage for India's independence in 1947.
It does. But as we know, that independence came at a devastating cost. The partition of India and Pakistan led to one of the largest mass migrations in human history, accompanied by horrific violence.
Millions displaced, countless lives lost. And Gandhi, witnessing this nightmare unfold after all he'd fought for, it's heartbreaking.
He was devastated. He spent his final days traveling across India, pleading for peace, trying to quell the violence.
It's a cruel twist of fate. After dedicating his life to a free and unified India, he witnesses it torn apart by the very forces he'd fought so hard to overcome.
It's a tragedy, no doubt. And his story ends tragically as well, with his assassination in 1948.
Shot by a Hindu nationalist who believed Gandhi had betrayed them by seeking reconciliation with Muslims.
It was a devastating loss. But even in death, Gandhi's message of nonviolent resistance continued to resonate.
His influence stretched far beyond India, inspiring movements for civil rights and social justice across the globe. He showed the world that change was possible, that even the most entrenched power structures could be challenged through the collective will of the people.
And he did it all while holding fast to his principles, to his belief in the power of truth and nonviolence, even in the face of unimaginable hatred and violence.
It's an incredible legacy, and honestly, it's a lot to live up to, but I think that's the point, isn't it? Gandhi's life challenges us to be better, to fight for what we believe in, even when it's hard, even when it seems impossible. He reminds us that each of us has the power to make a difference. Thanks for taking this deep dive with me.
It's been a privilege. And I hope our listeners feel inspired to learn more about this extraordinary man and his enduring legacy.